Welcome, and thanks for joining us at this first Friends at Home event for 2024. My name is Karen Butter, and I'm president of the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. The Friends of the Library is planning an exciting lineup of author and docent talks this year. I will review upcoming events in my closing remarks. And this is FAL's 50th anniversary. Our first book sale was held in 1974, so we're planning a series of events to celebrate our anniversary, including special Friends at Home talks. To welcome the new year, we're featuring author Megan Kamalei Kakimoto's book of stories, Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare. And we're delighted to welcome moderator Leisha Matsunobu. Before I turn it over to our moderator, there are a few technical details familiar to many of our viewers. This is a live webinar. The audio for the audience is muted and the video is turned off. Please use chat to introduce yourselves and to ask questions. And please be respectful in your comments. And we will record this talk. First, a few words about the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. We're a nonprofit organization that raises funds and advocates for an outstanding public library in Alameda. A special thanks to our supporters for their ongoing donations. As we wind up our fall appeal campaign, we ask that you consider a donation to the Friends in any amount that is comfortable for you via our website at alamedafriends.com or use the direct link that will be listed in the chat. Now on to our program. As I mentioned, our moderator is Leisha Matsumoto. Leisha works on the short-term forecasting team at the California ISO called the Independent System Operator, modeling electricity load and renewable resources availability. She recently moved to Walnut Creek after finishing her PhD in mechanical engineering at UC San Diego last summer, and we congratulate Leisha on receiving her doctorate. She is here tonight, though, because of her living in Hawaii, and she was born and raised on the island. And what she misses most is the ready availability of Spam musubis and bento lunches. She loves reading, and we're delighted to welcome Leisha to FAL and her conversation with author Megan Kakimoto. I'll turn it over to Leisha.
Thanks so much, Karen. And I think I'll just dive straight into introducing Megan. So Megan Kamalei Kakimoto is the Japanese and Kanaka Maoli author of the story collection Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare. USA Today national bestseller. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Granta, Joyland, and elsewhere. She has been a finalist for the Keene Prize for Literature and has received support from the Rona Jaffe Foundation and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. She received her MFA from the Mishner Center for Writers and is a visiting faculty in fiction at Antioch University, Los Angeles. A fiction editor for No Tokens Journal, she lives in Honolulu. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you so much, Leisha, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. I'm really excited.
I think you have a passage that you'd be willing to read from us to help start us off in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I am just going to start from reading Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare. I'll be reading the titular story, the opening, just the first few pages. So this is Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare. The first and only time she travels over the old Pali road with a container of pork, Sadie smears blood on the back seat of her parents' car. It's well past midnight, and the stretch of old Pali descends into darkness as they travel the bends of the mighty Ko'olaus. Sadie's stepfather, Lopaka, is behind the wheel, her mother, Kahea, a skeletal squirm of a woman taking up space in the front seat. They are fleeing the rural shadows of Ka'ava for Palolo, where they have a cottage, an unkempt backyard, and civilization to confront. Light posts splash a weak gloss on the asphalt, and with only a few cars traveling the roads, Lopaka pressures the gas pedal, wedging himself into speed as a cat nestles in tight spaces. Sadie has just gotten her period for the first time. She uses the hem of her new dress as a rag to sop the blood. As they veer down the Pali, Lopaka rolls down the windows, gusts whistling old tunes through the old Nissan. her mother's car, though Lopaka insists on driving. The wind flutters against the glass windows. Swaths of dark clouds migrate slowly over the ridgeline. The road steers around the Pali peaks, deprived of their pristine emerald sheen under the intensity of night. Sadie sees the seat drenched in the same darkness. She skims 2 fingers over the wet lip of her underwear and brings them to her nose, inhaling a whiff of blood so sharp she bears her head out the window. I'm dying, she is convinced. I'm going to die on the island's most haunted road, tearing over ancestor bones like they are nothing. Lopaka calls from the front seat, eyeing her horrified reflection in the rearview mirror. Hey, what you doing back there, girl? The car rolls down the Nu'uanu Pali tunnel that braids through the ridgeline, weak yellowed light blinking through the dark, just long enough for Sadie to see the blotches that have soaked the back seat, a deep burgundy beetling through the otherwise gray nylon. I'm bleeding, she says, too quiet at first. The car rattles through the end of the tunnel, emerging onto the tree-lined highway. Lopaka says, say that again? And Kahea says, just let it go for now. And Lopaka snaps back. Girl needs to learn for speak up. No one can hear a damn thing she says. And Sadie sniffs her hand and says to her mother, I'm bleeding. She leans forward, presenting her stained fingers. Kahea glances at the blood, which by now has cemented into crimson, arching her cuticles. She looks at Sadie with a flash of remorse, and then she is grinning. Oh, honey, it's about time. Sadie is 12 years old. Sadie feels around her underwear, and they are tearing over potholes in poorly paved road, going 70, 75, 80, 82, when a small figure emerges, straddling the lane divider toward which the car is gunning, and Lopaka slams on the brakes. Their bodies hurtling into the seatbelts, screeching. Someone is screaming. Steam skims the asphalt, choking the car's shell. The car is not moving. The person screeching stops screeching, goes quiet. They all go quiet. Sadie peers through the kicked-up dust, scans the dark road, spies a creature the size of a cat, maybe? Or perhaps an overweight mongoose, something that snips and snarls but to its core deeply fears you. She squints into the dark and sees a wild pua'a hunched low to the ground, its bristly tail and charcoal snout accentuated by the car's high beams, which Lopaka flashes and flashes, and Kahea whispers, my God. And then Sadie draws a breath at the sheen of her blood, and she senses that it's on its black coat. She stares at her fingers, sees the same blood. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the passage. Yeah, I want to get a little bit of background on you so that the audience can get to know who you are. So you grew up in Hawaii, is that right?
I did, yeah.
What are some ways in which you think you had a stereotypical Hawaiian childhood, maybe what people would imagine is stereotypical, and in what ways was your childhood uniquely yours?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in some ways, probably very perceivedly stereotypical in terms of, I was born and raised on Oahu and have lived in Makiki pretty much all my life. I, grew up eating shave ice, which is a very common treat, as you know. Grew up going to a place called John's Store after school and getting shave ice and like you said, spam musubi as an after school treat. But I think, in other ways, there were some things that I think people might perceive as being very maybe a given in terms of growing up here, what that might look like. That simply was not my experience. For example, my my mom's mom on my Hawaiian side, had never learned to swim and she was really afraid of the water. And she actually went to Kamehameha, which is where I went to school, which is where my mom went to school. And at least when I was there, they kind of teach you how to swim. And that's sort of an expectation. But because of that, my mom grew up not going to the beach ever. And so my childhood, I also didn't really grow up going to the beach or surfing the way that some people might sort of expect or kind of categorize as growing a typical childhood in Hawaii. So I think there's some ways that maybe I didn't have a sort of stereotypical upbringing.
That's really interesting you say that.
Yeah.
I feel like I have the exact same backstory of everyone else. Did you do
Yes.
surf? And it's like that just wasn't part of my childhood, but it
Yeah.
seems so like,
And
oh, I should
it's
have.
yeah, and it's interesting because actually a lot of not only Hawaiians but just like Kamaaina or people who grew up in Hawaii that I've talked to had really similar experiences where they also didn't, grow up going to the beach every weekend. But that's just sort of the romanticized, I guess, vision of a Hawaiian childhood.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, so yes, you talked again about the stopping at John's store, and you mentioned these dishes and the stories. It just made me think like, salivating while I'm reading it. But like Kahlua pork, lumpia, haupia pie, and every drop. Can you talk about some of your favorite spots growing up? What are your favorite treats? Did you make sure to add those to the story because you like the food so much?
I love that. Yeah, I have so many. I'm also just someone who really enjoys food. And I don't always enjoy cooking food, but I enjoy appreciating food and trying new food. But food was always kind of central to my own upbringing here. And I think it's funny that you mentioned that because I do think that a lot of the inclusion of food and specific names and places was a result of sort of living elsewhere for years and craving that, right? So I think John Store is one that has always stayed with me because that was just the childhood spot that we would go to. I also think about sort of getting bentos for the plane before we traveled from sometimes it would be teruyas and other times like taniokas. And I also this is probably more stereotypical, but I love Zippies and I've always loved Zippies and sort of the spot for fast casual dining. And I think the last would probably be Young's Fish Market for Hawaiian food, which is probably my personal favorite, which is hotly contested in my family.
Lots of places for people to
Yeah,
go try and visit. It's funny, Zippies had not come to the Big Island until I was like in high school, so I did not
really.
grow up with Zippies, but certainly heard about it
That's
all the
awesome.
time. Um, so yeah, as I just mentioned, I was born and raised on the Big Island, and I had occasional trips to Oahu growing up. There was like a trip to Maui that my family and I did once when I was young, but there are plenty of islands that I have not actually visited. Like Hawaii has a cohesive like culture and identity, but the islands themselves have different sort of vibes and sensibilities. So many of your stories, I think, are set in Oahu. There's some in Molokai. I was wondering, what is your relationship to the different islands? Have you visited them all? Did you do any traveling while writing this book?
Yeah, I have visited most of the Hawaiian Islands. I have spent some time in Hawaii Island and especially growing up on Oahu, at least for us, part of middle school and high school curriculum involved traveling to Hawaii Island to see the volcanoes and doing lessons on that. So I spent some time there. I've also been to Maui and Kauai. But I think probably the most meaningful time that I have spent has been mostly on Oahu, growing up here, and then on Molokai, specifically because that's where my Hawaiian side of my family is from. So we did have the privilege of going to visit sort of when we were children. And I actually have been trying to arrange a trip back while I'm working on my novel. And I haven't made it work yet. So that's hopefully in the cards for 2024.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Also, then that it makes me wonder. So in your story, Hotel
Mhm.
Molokai, um, are there semi-autobiographical elements from your own childhood that you added into the story where we have a young female protagonist traveling with her grandmother to Molokai and visiting her family?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, not every story that I write, but a lot of my stories the origins of them are deeply personal, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean completely based on like real experience, but they're things that are deeply personal to me and that are of interest to me. So, the seed of that story in particular really sprouted for me from the what people call sort of the phallic rock, and visiting that as a child and being really, really kind of confused by it as a sort of tourist attraction almost on Molokai. But there were other elements too of sort of visiting when your family might live there, but you yourself don't live there, and figuring out, negotiating what home means and your relationship to place. And I will say one of my most meaningful visits there was when I was around that character's age, around 14. And 14 is such a strange and pivotal age for a lot of people, and especially for girls. So I think it was important for me to be able to cull from my own experience while writing that piece in particular.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And how often would you generally go to Molokai when you were growing up?
It wasn't that often. My mom used to go when she was a child. She would spend every summer there for basically maybe 6 to 8 years, and she had a really complicated relationship to it. And I think I have a pretty equally complicated relationship to place and wanting to be present on the island and be present with family. But knowing that 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 the ocean kind of separates you when you're living in an archipelago. So yeah, it wasn't that frequent, which is one of the reasons why I really wanted to get back for the novel in particular.
That's interesting. So
Yeah.
um, I take it you are writing a novel then? Is
I
it from
am.
one of the short stories or a completely different story?
It's sort of it sees some inspiration from both the title story, Every Drop is a Man's Nightmare, as well as the final story in the collection, which is The Love and Decline of the Corpse Flower. And I am really sort of just interested in um, goddess Pele, the Hawaiian goddess of fire and volcanoes, as sort of this inspiration, and really looking at her power to, both destroy land, but also through that destruction to create new land. And I've always been really fascinated by that sort of duality. Um, so the novel is really interested in that. It's interested in more menstruation because I feel like it's one of my obsessions, and I will probably always be writing about menstruation. And it's also interested in mothers and daughters.
Very nice. Well,
Yeah,
looking forward to seeing that when it comes out.
thank you.
I think this is a really nice transition into the process of creating this story.
Mhm.
Um, can you talk a little bit about how it came to be when the collection really started coming together? Um, yeah, just some backstory about that.
Definitely. Yeah. So the collection as a whole, I probably spent about 4 to 5 years working on. The earliest story, Temporary Dwellers, kind of dates back to 2015. That was when I first started writing it. So some of the stories are a lot older. Some of them are much newer. But I think that, when I always, first of all, say that I have such a heart for short stories. I love reading short stories. I really enjoy writing short stories. And I've always been fascinated by story collections. I think there's a lot of really, really amazing kind of fine tuning and thought that goes into a collection that might not necessarily appear right away for a reader, but it's almost like work that's kind of operating in the background of the actual reading experience. And so I, had all these stories, and I didn't, I still couldn't really, I was having a hard time envisioning a book that might emerge from them. So for me, it was a matter of really sitting with the individual pieces and trying to um, see what kind of narrative might be coming out from all of these stories when looked at them together. And so that for me, that meant kind of putting aside some stories that I thought might appear or might have significance, and also writing new stories toward that envisioned book. And I was really wanting to put together a book that felt very authentic to my sort of lived experience as a mixed Hawaiian woman. But I also wanted to make space for some of my other like writerly obsessions and readerly obsessions. So, talking about menstruation, talking about food, sort of the treatment of women's bodies, as well as a lot of the sort of damaging and long lasting effects of colonialism on indigenous lands. So there's a lot of things that I was really excited to explore, that I felt like these stories were touching on and that were sort of speaking to each other. And I felt like I was able to sort of find a really great arc once I pinpointed how so many of these stories were also just invested in Hawaiian mythology and Hawaiian folklore, and seeing the way that the stories that I received orally as a child growing up, these tales, a lot of them were superstitions, how they were kind of appearing and reappearing in different stories. I realized, oh, that could be a really great, sort of uniting trait or interest that this book could kind of speak to. So I was really, when I was putting the collection together as a whole, I was trying to pay attention to just the way that the stories were ordered and how one story could kind of speak to another. I'm really interested in ordering in story collections. I know it's kind of more nitty gritty, but it's kind of,
I
it's
mean, that
fun.
was going to be my follow-up question. So
Yeah,
if you want to dive right into like
yeah.
how do you choose what comes first, like what follows another? Yeah. Did you write the stories and then order them, or did you sometimes like there's something missing here, I need to
Mm.
form a story to fill this gap? Yeah, can you speak to
Yeah,
that
I
process?
know, I love talking about process. And I think that, with collections, I'll say that I got a lot of really great insight first and foremost from, studying other collections and reading other collections that were really inspirational to me and impactful to me. And I also would mention how important of a editorial collaborator my agent was. Her name is Eva Lunny, and she's also from Hawaii. And she was a champion for the stories from day one. But she and my incredible editor, Callie, at Bloomsbury, they both really had really great insights about really thinking about the flow of a collection, right? And how looking at how the way that one story ends and placing it beside the way another story begins, how you can kind of create tension or create sort of a seamless transition, and depending on what sort of effect you want to achieve for a reader. So thinking about all that stuff, I wasn't thinking about that when I had first put the book together. So getting that insight was really, I think, crucial to seeing the book become what it is today. For me, I was really excited about the idea of starting this book with the story, A Catalog of Kanaka Superstitions, as told by your mother, which is sort of a list. And I liked the idea of starting with both a list and also a list of negations of things that someone should not do. And then diving right into the next story, where the protagonist does exactly what she's told not to do. And we kind of have to see the results of that behavior play out. And then when it came to sort of closing the collection, I was excited about ending with the story, The Love and Decline of the Corpse Flower, because it sort of sees two women at the end of their lives, and looking at reflecting back on their lives, and just thinking about how the story collection begins at a girl's first period, which is often considered a really significant moment into womanhood, and kind of tracing an arc to the end of a life, I thought was it was really appealing to me. And then the rest of the collection was a matter of, attending to just those sense of transition about when do we need to amp up tension? When might a reader just need a break? And that might be a good place to think about including a shorter story, something that they can kind of sit with. So yeah, it was very, again, kind of nitty gritty, but it took a lot of time. I think we spent close to maybe 4 to 6 months sitting with order and sitting with edits in that way. And I like to, I hope, and I think we were joking a little bit, Leisha, about sort of people who might not read the stories in order after all. So I've kind of laughed with my writer friends about that too, where some people are going to read out of order, and that's totally nothing, that's not anything I can control either.
Okay,
So
you don't hold anything against them.
absolutely not. I mean, I know what work went into it, right? And I like the idea of people reading it in the order that it appears, but I also don't have any control if they want to go a different route.
I mean, very, very tangential question, but when you listen to music, do you listen to albums all the way through, or will you skip around?
I think it's the first, for me, it's the first listen. It's the, like, if you're listening to an album for the very first time, I will absolutely listen from start to finish. But I think it's because I imagine that's the same experience for artists as well. But I'll totally skip around after that.
Okay. Um, yeah, so do you have a story that is particularly your favorite? One that you feel closest to, or it was easiest to write for whatever reason, and why?
Yeah, I always point to the Love and Decline of the Corpse Flower. It's the last story in the collection. And there's sort of this like beautiful alchemy that I can't really describe that happened while I was writing it, where the characters, this was one of the only times this ever happened, I think, for me in writing in general, but where sort of the characters um came to me really, really immediately with urgency, and I think people will say fully formed, right? They came to me in a very real way that felt very natural, and that was sort of demanding a story be built around them. And that was really interesting to me just because it had never happened before. So when I talk about sort of my writing process, I tend to write um, long, unwieldy, really messy first drafts, and then I'll do a lot of really meaningful work in putting a story together during revision. But for that story in particular, I felt like this story came just, again, very naturally, and I had very few revisions to make when I felt like it was done. And that just, again, sort of ineffable, kind of hard to describe what happened there. But it felt like a rare experience that I really enjoyed. And so that story kind of always has my heart. Yeah.
Wow. Did was there a particular event going on in your life, or were you like standing somewhere when the idea came to you? Is there a story
That's a
there?
really good question. I don't actually, I don't really, I don't think there was. I don't recall there being. I think what I've learned too is that I kind of, when I'm writing, my impulse too is to kind of have a tight control over story, character, voice, place. I, I, I don't know, I guess I'm just kind of a control freak in that way. But when the story breaks through for me is when I've kind of let go and just um relinquished a little bit of that control and sort of let a character do what a character is going to do, and kind of maybe just follow one decision after the other that they make, and let them, a lot of times those decisions are mistakes, and kind of let them make those mistakes. And I think with the Love and Decline of the Corpse Flower, maybe I I let go early. Like maybe I think it was a matter of like, seeing how, especially the unnamed protagonist in that story, she was very quick to come to me. And I think a lot of the characteristics of her really parallel a lot of the characteristics of my Grams, my late Grams. And so I think there was just a natural ease with which I was able to sort of become acquainted with her. And because of that, I think I just kind of trusted what she was doing on the page, even when it was a little kooky. Like, the story kind of opens with her inheriting this corpse flower, which is an enormous plant, and deciding to put it on a couch and put a blanket on it, and it's kind of a strange image, but I didn't want to have so much control over it. I kind of wanted to see where that might go, and it ended up being one of the most pleasurable writing experiences for me.
Wow. Yeah, and the corpse flower is sort of this famously smelly plant too, right?
So
Have
smelly.
you actually seen one in person and experienced that?
I did. I got to see my first corpse flower after I had written the first draft, but before the story was done in edits, ready to publish. So that was kind of cool because I was in Santa Cruz at the time, and the Santa Cruz what was it, the Arboretum, the UCSC Arboretum had a corpse flower that was just about to bloom. And the community of Santa Cruz, as I experienced it, was really small, but when that happened, hundreds of people came out, and like you had to like wait in this long line, and you couldn't really get up close for like hours. So I just braved it, and I waited as long as I needed to wait, and it was the wildest, worst smelling thing I've ever smelled. Um,
Wow.
but it was really great to have that experience before, what the story existed, or while the story existed, but before it was to press, because I felt like I could deepen that experience even more, and especially at the end of the story when the flower ends up going to a museum, right? And being able to kind of render the experience of the museum goers experiencing that, having had that same experience myself, I think was really cool.
That's really interesting, and somewhat unexpected for me that you would have, experienced that after
Yeah.
basically finishing the writing of it. How do you think about, or how do you approach writing experiences that you haven't had yet? So yeah, like having this
Yeah.
corpse flower, being a grandmother, or
Yeah.
etc. Yeah.
I love that question. I think that so much of what I like to write about a lot of times are also some of the things that scare me the most. So I guess an example would be sort of writing the story Mad Women. And that story for me was one of the harder stories that I've written. And it was sort of to me a portrait of motherhood. And motherhood is something that I have been preoccupied with for many, many years. And it's one of the things that scares me the most. And making that decision to become a mother and to raise a child. And for me, that story was sort of it was it was an experiment of just kind of throwing all of my anxieties onto the page and seeing what happened, um, which, again, was terrifying, but I think it was also a little freeing in a way, being able to explore them so deeply. Um, but also, I'll say that a lot of writing for me is is an act of, you know, intentionality, and it's a matter of, trying to be very intentional and thoughtful and responsible with your subject matter. So I when it came to writing the two senior women in The Love and Decline of the Corpse Flower, I myself am not a senior woman, but I have been around sort of figures like my grams and my other grandmas, being at her quilting class when I was growing up, and being surrounded by her friends and her church friends, and you know being an observer of the world in that way, I think is a crucial aspect of being a writer, and attending to all of the different ways there is to be a human in the world. And so that's just that, I guess that's really important for me. And then I'll just mention briefly about like, research, like with the corpse flower, that the corpse flower image kind of came to be from reading an article about a corpse flower, and I had never heard of it before. And I was fascinated by it. And I kind of went down a little bit of a research rabbit hole, just looking up images and reading about other people's experiences. And I think that's also just something for me when I'm writing, that I just want to feel confident in what I'm writing about. Otherwise, I get blocked very easily on the page. So that's another, I guess, aspect of my writing process
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that makes sense. And I want to circle back to something you mentioned a while ago, but your first drafts, you said being sort of these unwieldy, big behemoths, maybe that you sort of edit and revise down to these stories. What do you think you often cut or have to edit out from those unwieldy stories? Like what are you looking for when you approach that first draft for revision?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it tends to vary for me story by story. I am always really wanting to be very grounded in character, while I'm writing, and also when I'm reading back my work. And I will sort of, so my drafting process, again, it's very the drafting itself might seem a little quick, but the revision process is sort of, it's more meaningful work. I On the line level, I write like in that first draft 5 sentences when it should just be one, I guess, if I would use that example, because it's just the way that I kind of need to get my thoughts on the page. But I'm also a writer who really values concision, and I've been trying, even with the stories and beyond, always trying to find, that one precise image or that one precise line, that can capture a whole paragraph or a whole scene. It doesn't have to be every time, but I think that there's a lot to be said about concision in writing fiction. Um, and especially with a short story, you're already working with a much smaller canvas. And so I really want to make sure that every sentence can kind of stand on its own. And then when it comes to sort of figuring out what a draft needs to be, sometimes that takes a really long time. Like sometimes I'll write a story, I guess, thinking about the story Mad Women too. I'll write a draft of it, and then I'll have to put it aside. And that's something I'm really bad at is the putting it aside part, because I really deeply enjoy writing, and I like deeply enjoy the work that I get to do. So I feel like, oh, I always want to be working on a project. Like that's something that's always been in my head. And only in the last like 5-ish years have I been trying to cultivate patience and incorporate that into my practice, because that's sort of that's also just the time that the work needs, to be stepping away from it. And then I'll revisit another story, or I'll try to, write a scene that might become something else. But affording the work that space, 9 times out of 10, when I return to it, the piece has benefited from that time, and I kind of have a clearer vision for it. Whereas in an early draft, I might have all these different threads. I might have a lot of secondary characters that aren't, necessarily serving the story. So it's the space and the time away that allows me to see a piece a little clearer.
Okay, nice. And I think that nicely transitions to Aiko the writer. It's a story
Mm,
who this writer actually puts aside her work, and suddenly her work starts having a life
yeah.
of its own. So in that story, yes, in this story, this author feels a lot of anxiety about writing this night marcher story about her culture, and how her, I don't know if her grandma in that one too, or some
Mhm.
figure has told her, you don't touch our myths, like don't put them out for other, you don't put them for sale necessarily. in what ways was that a reflection of any conflict you might have felt in writing this? And did your feelings towards, writing these stories, any anxieties and stress, how did that manifest and change over the course of writing the book?
Yeah, I definitely held those anxieties. I hold those anxieties. I think that there's it's sort of a something I've noticed um, among writers of color or writers who are working um, uh, from marginalized experiences where there are simply not that many opportunities or even just current publications where we see our cultural stories reflected in contemporary fiction or in contemporary media. And I think it was really important to me when I was working on these stories, knowing that especially the cultural mythology and the Hawaiian folklore that was so important to me while writing them. Those are also really sacred, and they're also very, they're special not only to me and to my upbringing, but also to my Hawaiian communities. And I think that I wrestled with for a long time that drawing that line between, what is keeping something safe and keeping something um, guarded, I guess, versus sharing it widely, and toward what end and what is the point and what is the purpose. And I think that, I had to come to a place where I was feeling like knowing the intention behind the work and the intention behind wanting to invite more Indigenous Hawaiian writers in and to sort of help to build an even larger platform for Hawaiian stories to be received and valued in that way. That was always really important to me. And I think that there are so many storytellers and writers who have done that for me. And it was really, sort of a privilege to try to participate in that. But then there's also that challenge or that fear of doing wrong by the stories or not really in the story Aiko the writer, where she's very flippant with them. She's not really thinking about sort of the gravity of the fact that these stories are sacred and that they matter. And she's more thinking about how can she get them published right away to get this wide audience or that sort of thing. And I think that there's challenges for every writer, but especially for writers of color and writers, Indigenous writers, who are working with ancestral stories and inherited stories, and figuring out what that looks like for them. So I really spent a lot of time thinking about it. I spent a lot of time sort of talking within my own communities and receiving the way that they receive these stories, from their family, from their ohana, from their grams and papas, and trying to honor that and do right by that, but also not letting that fear of doing wrong by stories sort of stop me from writing as well, because I think it's important to show that Hawaiian stories matter, and they really are special, and I think that there's space for them to be received by many audiences, not just people within our own communities.
Great. Yeah. And I really appreciate the bravery, it takes to put these stories out there, but then also I'm grateful that these stories are now out there to reflect the sort of modern look at life in Hawaii.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think we're coming towards the end of our time. I am going to pull a question from the audience. Um, could you talk about any Hawaiian writers that were influential in your writing or specific works that you really gravitate towards?
Definitely. Yeah. So I always love to talk about Christiana Kahakawila, who is a short story writer as well. She wrote the collection This is Paradise. And I had it's very funny because she's always been sort of just this literary hero of mine. And she was one of the only Native Hawaiian short story writers that I had ever had the privilege of reading. So her book was absolutely influential to me and has, changed my writing life. And I have always just, pictured her as a hero. And then I had the very good fortune and privilege of being in conversation with her for one of my book events here in Honolulu, which was just such a mind-blowing thing where you get to actually speak with someone who, whether they know it or not, was so influential to you. So that was really special. And then, I also reading a lot of Kiana Davenport, and reading her fiction, and she has a lot of incredible novels that have been, very important to me. And I'll also mention T. Kira Mahealani Madden, who she's here now, and she's lived elsewhere as well. But she is a memoirist and a fiction writer. And she's another person that sort of Native Hawaiian who I've always really long admired, and now have the very good fortune of sort of calling a friend. And so it's been really wonderful, I guess. And what I'm trying to say is just meeting other Indigenous Hawaiian writers. Every time it feels sort of like a gift, and being able to be in conversation with them.
Really nice. And I do want to just pull out, let's do one last question. And maybe it's related to how this interview ends, but one of the questions here is, how do you know when your story is finished? I
Oh,
think that's a really nice place to
that's
end on.
no, yeah, that's such a good question. It's such a hard thing to talk about too, because it's just such a hard thing to discern. I think that the frustrating answer again is sort of every story demands a different attention to it, and that's specific to endings as well. I think that I I've developed enough of a sort of gut sense where I can't necessarily tell when a story is done, but I can tell when I've overworked it or when I personally am done with a story. And I think that there's a sense of sort of tinkering and knowing that, you can always, I believe anyway, I feel like you can always make a work better. But at a certain point, all that tinkering might be doing a disservice to actually putting the work out there. Sometimes you need to be okay with this being sort of the best of what you can do in this present moment, and sitting with that and knowing that that's okay. I think maybe a more less abstract answer might be, I try to look for any dropped threads or something that I didn't touch on, anything that's not really clicking in terms of character or story arc. I'll kind of pay attention to that. And then lastly is I really rely on my readers as well, in terms of my first readers who I am close with, and those, include a couple friends as well as my agent. And they're sort of good, really good. I think it's always really important for writers to have trusted readers that they can rely on, because when you're sitting with a work for however long, you really are not seeing it always in its entirety, and you're always going to miss something. So being able to have readers that you trust, who can kind of check you and check your story when it needs that eye, has been, at least for me, very, very helpful.
And do you ever feel scared about that first initial, like, sending out your draft
Sending
of
out
your story to your first readers?
Totally. I still do. And I think even knowing that, some of the two or three first readers are like some of my best friends, and I know that, but which means I know that they're going to be really honest with me. Like, they're not just going to tell me what I want to hear, which is like, this is brilliant. They're going to tell me what I need to hear and what the story needs to hear. So that's probably the scariest part. But I also just rely on that so much. And I know that everything that they say, even when it's feedback that might not resonate in the moment or might not resonate at all, is still getting me to think about a story differently, which I think is incredibly important.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for your time, and all this discussion of getting that look behind the work is always really great. I mean, love to see a writer from Hawaii making it. And
Yeah.
really appreciate your time tonight and talking about the stories.
Absolutely. And I really, yeah, I'm just grateful to be able to speak with you, especially as a fellow local. And, knowing that you came to the stories from your perspective has been really just a delight. So yeah, thank you.
And thank you to our audience, everyone who attended tonight. And I think with that, I'll pass it back to Karen.
Thank you all. This has been a fantastic discussion. I really learned so much. And it's wonderful to get a sense of the Hawaiian Islands from Megan's insightful exploration of Hawaiian identity and mythology, and her description of the writing process and the challenges she faces, particularly as an Indigenous writer. So I really learned so much from it. And I really want to thank both Leisha and Megan. And let's give them a virtual round of applause for an outstanding discussion. For those of us who are inspired to read the book, it's available at the Alameda Free Library and at Books Inc. in Alameda. So thank you again to our guests. Our second 2024 event is on January 17th, and it's a docent talk from the Contemporary Jewish Museum exhibit, First Light, Rituals of Glass and Neon Art, featuring artworks that explore the scientific processes while contemplating the role of light in our quest to understand our place in the universe. So this sounds really fascinating, and I hope you're all going to join us. We have another really fascinating discussion on February 7th with a Japanese artist, Yayo Kasuma, and she's often called Japan's most important living artist, and Kasuma has explored infinity in a variety of media, including her celebrated polka dot covered pumpkins. Her first Northern California Infinity Room is now on display at SF MoMA, and some have called it breathtaking. So this is definitely something that we all need to see. And then on March 6th, join us for a docent talk, Facing Mecca, Reflections of Islam. And this talk will explore the religious, secular, and cultural art and its role in Muslim societies. So please join us for these exciting events and invite your friends, and consider a donation to Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com, or check the chat for a link to support our fall appeal campaign. Watch our website, newsletter, and Facebook page for additional events and to register. And a special recognition to our production team, Serena Hom, Kumar Fonzie, Karen Romer, Karen Manuel, and Billy Reinschmidt. Finally, we extend a heartfelt thanks to our outstanding moderator, Leisha, and our author, Megan Kakimoto. And we look forward to seeing everyone at the next event. Good night.